The first threads of dawn crept across Exmoor on the 15th of March, 1983, but they brought no comfort to Richard Matthews. He had been farming these windswept highlands for 30 years, knew every dip and fold of this ancient moorland, understood the rhythms of birth and death that governed his herds. But nothing in those 3 decades had prepared him for what waited in the lower pasture that morning. The fog clung to the earth like something living, something that didn't want to yield its secrets. His boots crushed, frost-stiffened grass as he walked, each step echoing in the profound silence that settles over remote places before the world fully wakes. The sheep should have been moving by now, clustering near the gate where he always delivered their feed. Instead, there was only stillness. Only the fog and the distant caw of carrion birds already circling overhead. He found the first ewe near the stone wall that had stood for 2 centuries. The manner of death stopped him cold. This was no fox kill, no dog attack from a neighboring farm. The carcass had been opened with surgical precision, massive wounds that spoke of tremendous strength, and razor-sharp instruments of death. The blood had barely spread across the frozen ground. Whatever had done this had killed with devastating efficiency. 3 more sheep lay scattered across the pasture, each bearing the same horrific injury. Clean kills. Professional kills. The work of something that understood exactly where to strike, how to tear through hide and muscle with minimal effort. Matthews had seen enough livestock deaths to know predator patterns. Foxes left telltale signs of struggle. Dogs killed chaotically, with frenzy. This was different. This was controlled violence from a predator that shouldn't exist in the English countryside. What stalks the fog-shrouded moorlands of southwest England? What apex predator leaves trained farmers trembling and entire communities sleeping with doors locked and shotguns loaded? For more than 4 decades, Exmoor has harbored Britain's most persistent cryptid mystery. Hundreds of witnesses across Somerset and Devon have reported glimpses of something impossible, something that defies the neat categories of British wildlife. Some call it a phantom. Others know it as the Beast of Exmoor, and the evidence of its existence lies scattered across remote pastures in the form of mutilated livestock and shattered certainties about what belongs in these ancient hills. The mystery deepened in ways that would draw government attention and military intervention. A coordinated hunt involving Royal Marines would sweep across these moors, seeking something that official records claim cannot exist. Yet the killings continued. The sightings multiplied. And the question that Richard Matthews confronted that frozen morning in 1983 remains unanswered to this day. In the isolation of Exmoor, in the pre-dawn fog where visibility shrinks to mere feet, and every sound carries the weight of ancient fears, something hunts, something watches, something waits. The law that changed everything came into effect on the 1st of August, 1976. The Dangerous Wild Animals Act was supposed to bring order to a chaotic situation, to rein in the exotic pet trade that had flourished throughout Britain during the 60s and early 70s. But like so many legislative solutions, it created consequences nobody had predicted. Consequences that would prowl the moorlands and valleys of the West Country for generations to come. Before 1976, keeping a big cat in Britain was surprisingly easy. You didn't need a license, didn't need special permission, didn't even need to prove you could safely contain an animal designed by nature to kill. The post-war years had seen a peculiar fashion among the wealthy and eccentric, a desire to own pieces of the wild, to keep panthers in garden enclosures and pumas in converted stables. Some estimates suggest there were dozens, perhaps hundreds, of large exotic cats scattered across the country, living in private collections, small zoos, and the estates of people who thought a big cat made for interesting conversation at dinner parties. Then the legislation arrived, and with it came fees, inspections, and stringent requirements for housing these animals. The cost was substantial. The paperwork was extensive. The scrutiny was unwelcome. And so, according to widespread belief, many owners made a different choice entirely. Rather than comply with the new law, rather than pay the licensing fees or build the required enclosures, they simply opened the cages and let their exotic pets disappear into the British countryside. Nobody knows exactly how many big cats were released in that period. The government kept no records of how many exotic animals had been kept privately before the act came into force. There were no registries, no databases, no way to track what had been set free. But the timing is impossible to ignore. The sightings began in earnest, almost immediately after the legislation took effect, clustering particularly in areas that had been home to private animal collections and small menageries. Exmoor became ground zero for something that defied easy explanation. The moorland that stretches across the border between Devon and Somerset had always been a place of folklore and shadow, where ancient legends spoke of supernatural hounds and spectral huntsmen. But in the late 1970s, the stories took on a different quality, something more tangible and immediate. It started with the sheep. Farmers on Exmoor had dealt with predators before, the usual fox taking a lamb now and then, nothing that couldn't be managed. But beginning in 1973, several years before the act, but as the legislation was being debated, something changed. Farmers began finding their animals killed in ways they had never seen before. The sheep weren't torn apart the way a dog pack would do it. They weren't half-eaten and scattered like fox kills. Instead, they showed signs of expert predation, clean kills with precise puncture wounds to the throat and skull, the kind of efficiency that spoke to a much larger, much more capable hunter. Eric Lay was one of the first farmers to speak publicly about the killings on his land near South Moulton. He described finding sheep with their throats ripped out, the wounds too large and too clean to be the work of any domestic animal. What disturbed him most, he said in interviews from the late 70s, was the intelligence behind the kills. Whatever was hunting his flock seemed to understand patterns, to wait until he had moved his sheep to particular fields, to strike when they were most vulnerable. It felt calculated, he said, like being up against something that could think. Other farmers reported similar experiences. Sheep found with broken neck. Lambs taken cleanly from the middle of flocks, without the surrounding animals showing signs of panic until the moment of attack. Carcasses dragged distances that seemed impossible for any dog or fox to manage. And the tracks, when they could be found in soft ground, were wrong. Too large, with the distinctive four-toed pad marks of large felines, shapes that didn't match anything that was supposed to exist on the British moorland. By 1980, the phenomenon had acquired a name. The Beast of Exmoor entered public consciousness through newspaper reports and television coverage of the livestock killings. Farmers were losing animals at a rate that threatened their livelihoods. Some claimed to have lost more than 100 sheep to whatever was hunting the moor. The Ministry of Agriculture sent officials to investigate. Royal Marines were eventually deployed with night vision equipment to hunt for the predator, though they found nothing conclusive. But the deeper you look into the history, the more complicated the picture becomes. The 1976 legislation provides a neat explanation, a rational framework for understanding why big cats might roam Britain. Released exotic pets, surviving and breeding in the wild, adapting to the British landscape. It makes sense. It has the virtue of being plausible. And yet, the folklore suggests something older is at work, something that stretches back far beyond the Dangerous Wild Animals Act. Devon and Somerset have stories of mysterious black cats that predate the 20th century entirely. In the 1800s, there are scattered references in local histories to large black felines seen on the moors, creatures that terrorized livestock and eluded hunters. Some folklorists point to even older legends, medieval tales of demonic cats and supernatural beasts that haunted the isolated valleys and ancient forests of the West Country. In 1700 and something, though the exact date varies depending on the telling, a large black cat was supposedly killed near the village of Kellis in Scotland. The creature was preserved, though whether it was a hybrid, a melanistic wildcat, or something else entirely remains disputed. Similar stories appear throughout British folklore, whispers of cats that are not quite cats, predators that seem too large, too intelligent, too persistent to be entirely natural. This raises an uncomfortable question. Are we looking at a modern phenomenon with a convenient historical explanation, or are we seeing the latest iteration of something much older? The exotic pet theory fits the evidence from the 70s onward, but it struggles to account for the earlier sightings, the older stories, the persistent folklore that speaks of mysterious black cats long before anyone in Britain was importing panthers from abroad. Some researchers have suggested that a small population of larger felines may have survived in Britain far longer than the official record acknowledges. The Eurasian lynx is known to have inhabited Britain in historical times, though it's believed to have been hunted to extinction by medieval times. But what if some survived in the remotest areas, in the vast moorlands and deep forests where human presence was sparse? What if the stories of black cats in Devon and Somerset reflect a continuous, if rare, presence of larger predators that we simply never fully eradicated? Others point to the possibility of repeated introductions over centuries. Exotic animals have been brought to Britain since Roman times. Medieval menageries, traveling shows, private collections of the aristocracy all provided opportunities for escapes and releases long before the 1970s. Perhaps what we're seeing is not a single event, but a pattern that repeats across generations, each era finding its own explanation for creatures that should not exist, but somehow do. The eyewitness accounts from the early period of modern sightings share certain consistent details that are difficult to dismiss. Trevor Beer, a former vet and big cat researcher, collected dozens of testimonies from people who claim to have seen the Beast of Exmoor in the late 70s and early 80s. What emerges from these accounts is a portrait of an animal that seems abnormally large, significantly bigger than even a large dog, with the distinctive build of a big cat, muscular and low to the ground. Witnesses repeatedly describe the intelligence in the animal's behavior. Unlike encounters with wild animals that typically flee immediately from humans, the beast is often reported as pausing, assessing, seeming to evaluate the situation before deciding whether to retreat. Some witnesses describe a sense of being watched, of feeling eyes on them from the shadows of hedgerows and the edges of woodland, moments before catching a glimpse of something large and dark, slipping away with unnatural silence. The color is almost always black, or very dark brown, appearing black in most light. This melanistic coloring, while rare, does occur naturally in leopards and jaguars, turning them into the animals we commonly call panthers. If exotic cats were indeed released in the 70s, leopards from Asia or Africa would be likely candidates, and a percentage of those would carry the genes for melanism. The description fits, but it also fits the folklore, the old stories that always speak of black cats, creatures of darkness and shadow that embody something more than mere animal predation. What makes the early sightings particularly compelling is their consistency across multiple independent witnesses who had no connection to each other. These were not people seeking publicity or looking to start rumors. They were farmers worried about their livestock, motorists who happened to glimpse something unusual crossing the road at dusk, walkers on the moors who stumbled across something they couldn't explain. The reports came from different areas of Exmoor, from different types of people, but they described essentially the same thing: a large black cat that moved with fluid grace, and seemed far too substantial to be any kind of misidentification. The phenomenon established itself in the public imagination with remarkable speed. Within a few years of the first major wave of sightings, the Beast of Exmoor had become part of local identity, a modern legend rooted in contemporary experience, but carrying echoes of older, darker stories. People began to see it everywhere, of course, once the idea took hold. Not every sighting was credible. Not every report stood up to scrutiny. But beneath the inevitable exaggerations and misidentifications, something real seemed to be moving through the landscape. Something that killed with precision and vanished without trace. The question of whether this phenomenon predates modern explanations may ultimately be unanswerable. We have the folklore, the old stories, the scattered historical references. We have the timing of the dangerous Wild Animals Act and the sudden surge in sightings that followed. We have the physical evidence of livestock killed in ways that suggest large predators, though never quite enough evidence to prove it conclusively. What we're left with is uncertainty, a space where the rational explanation and the folkloric tradition overlap and blur into something that resists easy categorization. Perhaps that's what makes the Beast of Exmoor so enduring. Not that we can't explain it, but that every explanation feels somehow incomplete, leaving room for something wild and unknown to persist in the margins of the modern world. The pre-dawn air over South Moulton carried an unusual stillness in the winter of 1983. Eric Lay had learned to dread that quiet. For 3 weeks now, he had risen before the sun, boots crunching through frost-stiffened grass, moving toward his sheep pastures with a knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. And for 3 weeks, He had found them. Bodies cooling in the darkness, their shapes somehow wrong against the moorland grass. The first kill had seemed like cruel misfortune, perhaps even natural causes. A ewe, her neck twisted at an angle that made Eric's stomach turn. But there were no wounds he could see at first glance, no blood pooling beneath her, no signs of the violent struggle that should accompany a fox attack or a dog mauling. He had called the veterinarian that morning, expecting confirmation of disease, or perhaps a lightning strike, though the skies had been clear for days. What the vet found defied explanation. The sheep's neck had been broken with what he described as surgical precision. A single clean fracture at the base of the skull. No tearing of flesh, no defensive wounds on the animal's legs or flanks. When they opened the carcass, they discovered something even more disturbing. The blood had been almost completely drained from the body, yet there were no puncture wounds large enough to account for such blood loss. Certain organs, the heart and liver primarily, had been consumed with what the vet could only describe as methodical efficiency. The cuts, if they could be called that, were clean. Too clean. Eric had farmed sheep for 23 years. He knew every way an animal could die on the moorland. He had seen foxes take lambs, their kills chaotic and wasteful, leaving half-eaten carcasses scattered across the pasture. He had dealt with dogs, those devastating raids that left wool and blood and panic in their wake, sheep injured and traumatized, running mindlessly until they collapsed. He had even encountered the rare badger attack, brutal and frenzied. This was none of those things. The second sheep died 4 nights later, then another, then 2, in a single night. By the end of the first week, Eric had lost 11 animals. By the end of the second week, the count had risen to 37. Each kill bore the same disturbing hallmarks: broken necks, drained blood, organs removed with uncanny precision. No signs of struggle, no sounds in the night. Eric began sleeping in his barn, or rather, trying to sleep. He would wrap himself in blankets, a thermos of tea at his side, and station himself where he could watch the flock through the wide barn doors. The sheep grew nervous, clustering together in tight groups even during daylight hours. They sensed something was wrong, some predator moving through their world that operated by rules they did not understand. On the 13th night of his vigil, Eric finally heard something. Not the barking of dogs or the screaming of attacked sheep, but a different sound altogether. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. He grabbed his torch and his shotgun, hands shaking not from cold, but from something more primal. The beam of light swept across the pasture, catching the reflective eyes of his sheep, huddled and trembling. But there was something else. A shadow, massive and low to the ground, moving with fluid grace along the stone wall that bordered his property. Eric raised the gun, his finger on the trigger, but the shadow was already gone, melting into the darkness between one heartbeat and the next. In the morning, he found 3 more bodies. The financial devastation was crushing. Each sheep represented income, breeding stock, years of careful husbandry. Eric had invested everything into building his flock, improving bloodlines, establishing relationships with buyers. Now he was watching his livelihood bleed away into the moorland soil. Insurance companies were skeptical. Without clear evidence of a known predator, they hesitated to pay claims. Dog attacks were covered. Fox predation was covered. But this defied their categories, their neat boxes of agricultural loss. But it was the emotional toll that truly broke him. Eric's wife, Margaret, watched her husband age years in a matter of weeks. He stopped eating properly, surviving on tea and whatever she could force into his hands. He stopped sleeping, even when he came inside, jerking awake at every sound. His eyes developed dark hollows, his hands a persistent tremor. He began to doubt himself, to wonder if he was somehow failing in his duty as a shepherd, as a farmer, as the guardian of creatures who depended on him utterly. And then the whispers started reaching him from neighboring farms. Robert Cunningham, whose land bordered Eric's to the north, had lost 16 sheep over the course of 2 weeks. Same kills, same precision, same impossible draining of blood. Mary Thornton, 3 miles east, had found her prize ran dead in the center of her pasture, neck broken, organs gone. Thomas Wade reported 23 losses. Patricia Morris, a veteran farmer who had weathered every agricultural crisis of the past 4 decades, called Eric, with a voice shaking with something close to fear. She had found 7 sheep dead in a single morning, arranged in a rough circle, as if something had methodically worked its way around them. A pattern was emerging, one that terrified the farming community of South Moulton and the surrounding moorland. The attacks were moving in a deliberate arc across the countryside, striking farms in sequence, spending a week or two at each location before moving on. Whatever was responsible possessed intelligence, strategy. It was selecting targets, timing its attacks, and executing them with a level of skill that no known predator could match. The Ministry of Agriculture sent an investigator, a man named Collins, who arrived with clipboards and skepticism. He examined the carcasses, took photographs, collected samples. He interviewed Eric and the other farmers, listening to their accounts with the polite detachment of someone convinced he was dealing with hysterical farmers and misidentified dog attacks. He suggested better fencing. He recommended electric wire. He implied, though never stated directly, that perhaps the farmers themselves were not being entirely truthful about the nature of the attacks. Eric never forgot the rage that boiled up in him during that interview. The suggestion that he was lying, that he was somehow fabricating or exaggerating the slaughter of his own flock, cut deeper than any financial loss. He took Collins out to the field where 4 fresh kills lay waiting. He made the man kneel in the frost and examine the wounds, or rather, the lack of wounds. He forced him to acknowledge that whatever was happening here fell outside normal agricultural experience. Collins filed his report. Nothing came of it. The attacks continued. By the time the predator finally moved on from Eric's farm, he had lost 117 sheep, 117 animals, each representing hours of work, years of breeding, irreplaceable genetic lines. His flock was decimated. His finances were in ruins. His health was shattered. And he was left with a conviction that burned in his gut with absolute certainty. No dog had done this. No fox, no badger, no combination of known predators could account for what he had witnessed. Something else moved across the moorland in 1983. Something powerful enough to break a sheep's neck with a single blow. Something intelligent enough to drain blood without leaving evidence of how. Something methodical enough to consume organs with surgical precision. The neighboring farmers who had suffered similar attacks began meeting informally, gathering in kitchens and barns to share their experiences and their theories. Some spoke of big cats, exotic predators escaped or released from private collections. Others referenced older stories, legends of black dogs and demon hounds that had stalked the moors for centuries. A few, after enough whiskey, mentioned things that had no name at all, creatures from the spaces between what was known and what could be admitted. Eric himself never settled on an explanation. He knew only what he had seen, what he had lost, and what he believed in his bones. Something had come to his farm in the winter of 1983. Something that killed with purpose and precision. Something that moved through the darkness like smoke and left only death in its wake. And though it eventually departed, moving on to terrorize other communities, other farmers, Eric Lee never truly recovered from those weeks of slaughter. The shadows on his moorland pastures never looked quite the same again. The radio crackle came through just after midnight on July 14, 1983. A secure line, scrambled frequencies, the kind of communication reserved for matters of national security. At the other end, Royal Marines commandos stationed at 40 Commando in Taunton, Somerset, received orders that would seem absurd if they hadn't come through official channels. They were being deployed not against Soviet incursions or terrorist threats, but to hunt an animal. Not just any animal, though. The Beast of Exmoor had finally provoked a response that would become one of the most controversial military operations on British soil. The decision didn't come lightly. By the summer of 1983, the livestock losses across Exmoor had reached catastrophic proportions. Over 200 sheep had been found dead in ways that defied conventional explanation. Farmers were losing not just animals, but livelihoods. Insurance companies were refusing to pay out, citing lack of evidence for covered predators. The political pressure had become unbearable. Conservative MP for Tiverton, Robin Maxwell Hislop, had raised the matter in Parliament 3 separate times. Local councils were threatening legal action against the Ministry of Agriculture. Something had to be seen to be done. but the official explanation never quite added up. Why send Royal Marines, some of Britain's most elite fighting forces, to deal with what officials publicly dismissed as probably just feral dogs? Why equip them with military-grade night vision equipment and high-powered rifles with infrared scopes when local hunters could have been hired for a fraction of the cost? The paperwork trail, obtained years later through Freedom of Information requests, reveals something peculiar. The operation was classified under a security designation normally reserved for counterinsurgency operations. Someone, somewhere in the chain of command, believed this was more than a simple pest control problem. The unit deployed consisted of 2 full sections, approximately 24 Marines in total. They arrived in unmarked Land Rovers, establishing a temporary base at a requisition barn near South Moulton. The local police had been informed but instructed to maintain distance. This was strictly a military operation. Leading the deployment was a color sergeant whose name remains redacted in all official documents, referred to in reports only as Color Sergeant MM. Veterans of the unit who've spoken anonymously in subsequent years describe him as a Falklands veteran, a man who'd seen combat just a year earlier in the South Atlantic. He took the mission seriously, treating the briefing with the same gravity as any combat deployment. The equipment they carried tells its own story. Each Marine was issued an L42A1 rifle, the standard sniper weapon of the era, chambered in 7.62mm NATO rounds. These weren't pest control weapons. These were rifles designed to kill human targets at distances exceeding 800 meters. They carried first-generation night vision equipment, image intensifiers that turned darkness into grainy green visibility. These devices were cutting-edge technology for the time, expensive and strictly controlled. Their deployment for a supposed animal hunt raised eyebrows even within the military community. The operation commenced on July 15th and was scheduled to run for 2 weeks. The Marines established observation posts across the moor, particularly concentrated in the areas around South Moulton, Simon's Bath, and the remote valleys where livestock deaths had been most frequent. They worked in rotating shifts, with teams going out at dusk and maintaining watch through the darkest hours until dawn. Their orders were clear and deeply unusual. Observe, identify, and if possible, eliminate the target. But they were also instructed to preserve any kills for examination, to photograph extensively, and to maintain radio silence unless contact was made. The first 3 nights yielded nothing but the normal sounds of the moor. Deer moving through heather, foxes on their nightly rounds, the wind that never quite stops on those exposed highlands. But on the 4th night, July 18th, something changed. Multiple teams reported movement that didn't match known animal patterns. Color Sergeant M's log entry, partially declassified in 2012, describes the team seeing something large moving across an open ridge approximately 400 meters from their position. Through the night vision, it appeared as a heat signature significantly larger than any dog, moving with what he described as unusual deliberation. They tracked it for approximately 15 minutes before it descended into a valley and disappeared from view. When they investigated the area at first light, they found tracks. The plaster casts taken that morning still exist in private collections, having been kept by one of the Marines who participated. They show prints approximately 11 centimeters across, wider than any domestic dog but with canine characteristics. The stride length measured nearly 1 meter between prints, suggesting an animal of considerable size moving at moderate pace. What disturbed the Marines most wasn't the size, but the depth. The ground was relatively dry that week, yet these prints sank deep into earth that barely showed their own boot impression. Over the following nights, multiple teams reported similar encounters, shapes at the edge of visibility, movement that seemed to anticipate their positions. One team, stationed near Chalicombe, reported watching something approach a sheep pen just after 3 in the morning on July 21st. Through the night vision, they observed it clear a fence that stood nearly 1 meter high, landing silently on the other side. Before they could get a clear sight picture through their rifle scopes, it had moved into dead ground, using the terrain with what the report described as tactical awareness. This phrase appears multiple times in the declassified portions of the operation log. Tactical awareness. Not animal cunning or instinct, but awareness, as if whatever they were tracking understood it was being hunted and was actively evading military surveillance. Several Marines later reported an unnerving feeling that they were being observed in return, that whatever was out there knew exactly where they were positioned. On July 23rd, the operation reached its climax. Two separate teams reported simultaneous contact in areas approximately 3 kilometers apart. This shouldn't have been possible if they were tracking a single animal. The northern team, positioned near Brendan Common, radioed in that they had a clear target in sight, something large drinking from a stream. The southern team, near Withypool, reported watching something take down a sheep in real time. Both teams fired. The northern team discharged 3 rounds. The southern team fired twice. All shots were reported as hits by experienced marksmen who'd qualified as snipers. When they investigated at dawn, they found nothing. No bodies, no blood trails, no indication that any animal had been hit, let alone killed. The sheep at the southern location was indeed dead, its throat torn open in the now familiar pattern, but there was no sign of whatever had killed it. The ground showed disturbance, but no clear tracks. It was as if their target had simply vanished. The final week of the operation grew increasingly tense. Frustration mounted among the Marines, professional soldiers unaccustomed to failure. They expanded their patrol patterns, used thermal imaging equipment, rushed in from military research facilities, and even attempted to bait their quarry with injured livestock under observation. Nothing worked. Whatever was out there, if anything, had either left the area or had gone completely to ground. On July 29th, the operation was officially terminated. The Ministry of Defense released a brief statement indicating that Marines had conducted surveillance operations on Exmoor, but had found no evidence of any unusual predator. The matter was referred back to local authorities and the Ministry of Agriculture. Officially, the operation was classified as a failure, an expensive exercise that had achieved nothing beyond reassuring the public that action had been taken. But the official narrative immediately faced skepticism. Locals who'd observed the operation from a distance noted that the military presence didn't completely withdraw on July 29. Several residents reported seeing Land Rovers and personnel in the area for several days afterward. A farmer near Simonsbath claimed he was ordered to keep his livestock penned and warned to stay inside after dark on the nights of July 30th and 31st, well after the operation had supposedly concluded. Then there were the Marines themselves. Military personnel are trained to maintain operational security, but over the years, fragments of testimony have emerged. A former Marine, speaking to a researcher in 1998, under condition of anonymity, claimed they had found something on the final night of the operation. Something that was immediately classified. He wouldn't elaborate, stating only that they were debriefed separately upon return to base and instructed never to discuss certain aspects of what they'd observed. Another veteran, speaking at a military reunion in 2006, had clearly been drinking when he made a cryptic comment about the Exmoor operation. Someone asked him about it directly, and he replied that they'd been hunting the wrong thing. When pressed, he clammed up, but added that sometimes the best outcome is not finding what you're looking for. His former comrades quickly changed the subject. The conspiracy theories multiplied in the vacuum of official information. Some claimed the Marines had indeed killed the creature, but that the body had been removed for secret examination by government scientists. Others suggested they'd discovered it was something they couldn't publicly acknowledge, perhaps an exotic animal escaped from a private collection owned by someone with political connections. The most extreme theories proposed they'd encountered something genuinely unknown, something that the government decided was better left unacknowledged than risk public panic. The truth likely lies somewhere in the mundane middle ground, yet the questions persist. The Ministry of Defense has never released the full operational logs. Freedom of information requests have been partially granted, but key sections remain redacted under national security exemptions that seem absurdly disproportionate for a simple animal hunt. The photographic evidence taken during the operation, referenced in the partial logs, has never been made public. What remains undeniable is that the British government deployed military special forces to hunt an animal on domestic soil, an unprecedented action that has never been repeated. Whatever they found or didn't find in those 2 weeks on Exmoor, someone decided it warranted the kind of response normally reserved for genuine threats to national security. The beast, if it existed, had provoked something extraordinary. And then, as mysteriously as the killings had escalated, they stopped. Within weeks of the Marine withdrawal, Livestock deaths on Exmoor returned to normal background levels. Whatever had been out there seemed to have gone. The photograph exists in that peculiar realm between proof and possibility. A grainy image frozen in time that has sparked decades of debate and kept the legend of the Beast of Exmoor alive in ways that mere stories never could. When Trevor Beer stepped forward in 1988 with his camera and the images he had captured, he forever changed the nature of the conversation surrounding these mysterious big cats prowling the moorlands of Cornwall. Beer was not some attention-seeking opportunist looking for his moment in the spotlight. He was a respectable figure in the community, known for his steadiness and reliability, which lent his testimony a weight that other sightings might have lacked. On a February morning in that year, he was going about his routine, driving along a quiet stretch near the moor, when movement caught his eye. What he saw next would become one of the most analyzed and debated pieces of evidence in British cryptozoology. Through his viewfinder, Beer captured what appeared to be a large black cat stalking through the undergrowth. The creature in his photographs displays unmistakable feline characteristics, a powerful musculature visible even in the imperfect lighting, a distinctive predatory posture that no dog could replicate, and proportions that far exceeded those of any domestic animal. When these images were released to the public, they created an immediate sensation. What made Beer's evidence so compelling was not just the photographs themselves, but what happened when they were subjected to expert analysis. Photo analysts at the Royal Air Force Station at RAF St. Mawgan examined the images with the kind of technical rigor typically reserved for reconnaissance photography. These were not amateur hobbyists or believers looking to confirm their own theories. These were trained professionals whose job demanded skepticism and precision. Their conclusions were maddeningly inconclusive in the way that truly credible analysis often is. They could not identify the animal in the photograph as anything known to exist in the British countryside. The size was all wrong for a domestic cat, the proportions inconsistent with any native species, and the structure clearly feline rather than canine. Yet they stopped short of declaring it proof of anything extraordinary. Professional caution demanded that much. What they would say, however, was that they could not dismiss it. They could not explain it away. That careful, qualified statement from experts carried more weight than any enthusiastic proclamation could have. Beer himself never wavered in his account. In the years following his photographs, he maintained the same consistent story, refusing to embellish or dramatize what he had seen. He described the animal as jet black, moving with a fluid grace that spoke to predatory power, approximately the size of a large dog, but unmistakably feline in every aspect of its movement and form. The creature had shown no fear of human presence, no startled response, only a calm acknowledgement of being observed before melting back into the landscape. The psychological impact on Beer was subtle but profound. He had seen something that should not exist, captured it on film, and then watched as the world argued over what his own eyes had witnessed. There is a particular kind of frustration that comes with such experiences, knowing absolutely what you have encountered while watching others dissect and debate and ultimately remain uncertain. It creates a strange isolation, standing on one side of a divide between the witnessed and the theoretical. But Beer's photographs were far from the only credible encounter that painted a consistent picture of these mysterious cats. The roads crisscrossing the moorland have served as unexpected stages for dozens of encounters, those sudden moments when the ordinary journey transforms into something that defies explanation. One motorist, driving home just after dusk on a September evening, found herself confronted with an experience that would haunt her for years. She was traveling along a narrow lane that skirted the edge of the moor, her headlights cutting through the gathering darkness, when a shape materialized in the road ahead. Her first thought was that someone had lost their dog, a large black dog crossing the lane with apparent unconcern for the approaching vehicle. She slammed on her brakes, the car shuddering to a halt, mere feet from the animal. And in those suspended seconds, bathed in the harsh glare of her headlights, she saw clearly what had stepped into her path. It was not a dog. Every detail screamed feline to her shocked senses. The way it moved, placing each paw with deliberate precision, the structure of its face when it turned to regard her with complete indifference, the length and thickness of its tail that curved slightly at the tip. The size was what truly terrified her. This was no house cat grown large. The animal stood as tall at the shoulder as a German shepherd, its body muscular and dense with power. Its coat absorbed the light, so intensely black that it seemed to create a void in the illuminated road, a cat-shaped absence where light went to die. But it was the eyes that she would remember most vividly. Those moments when the creature met her gaze with eyes that reflected the headlights back in brilliant yellow. Yellow eyes, glowing like small suns in that black face, regarding her with an intelligence and confidence that spoke to apex predator status. There was no fear in those eyes, no concern about the large metal object that had nearly struck it. Only a calm assessment, a momentary consideration, before the animal continued its journey across the road and vanished into the heather on the opposite side. The entire encounter lasted perhaps 10 seconds. The motorist sat in her idling car for several minutes afterward, hands trembling on the steering wheel, trying to process what she had just witnessed. When she finally continued home, she drove with exaggerated care, eyes constantly scanning the roadside for any hint of movement. She reported the sighting the next day, her account carefully detailed and consistent, marked by the kind of specificity that comes from genuine experience rather than imagination. The psychological aftermath of such encounters often follows a predictable pattern. First comes the shock of witnessing something impossible. Then the desperate attempt to rationalize, to fit what was seen into the framework of the known world. Perhaps it was just an unusually large dog in poor lighting. Perhaps the fear and adrenaline distorted perception, but those explanations crumble under the weight of remembered detail. The witnesses know what they saw. They know how it moved, how it looked at them, how thoroughly and completely wrong any mundane explanation feels. Yet even these sudden road encounters pale in comparison to the terror experienced by those who have been stalked by these creatures across the lonely expanses of the moor. Being followed by an unseen predator triggers something primal in the human psyche, awakening ancient fears that civilization has only thinly covered. One hiker's testimony stands out for its duration and the psychological ordeal it describes. She had set out for what should have been a pleasant afternoon walk across a well-traveled section of the moorland, following established paths under clear skies. She was experienced, properly equipped, and familiar with the terrain. Nothing about the day suggested anything unusual. About an hour into her walk, crossing a section where the heather grew thick and tall on either side of the narrow path, she first sensed that something was wrong. It began as that inexplicable feeling of being watched, the prickling sensation at the back of the neck that evolution has preserved as a warning system. She stopped, turning slowly, scanning the landscape. The heather stretched away in all directions, rippling in the breeze. Nothing seemed out of place. She continued walking, but the feeling intensified. Then she heard it. Movement in the heather, pacing her, keeping parallel to the path. The sound was rhythmic, deliberate, something large pushing through the dense vegetation with steady purpose. She stopped again. The movement stopped. She started walking. The movement resumed. This pattern continued for over a mile, and with each repetition, her fear escalated. The thing in the heather was tracking her, matching her pace, stopping when she stopped. She could hear breathing now, heavy exhalations that carried across the short distance between path and pursuer. The sound was unmistakably animal, unmistakably large, and unmistakably focused on her. She began to walk faster. The movement in the heather accelerated to match. She could see the tops of the plants swaying, marking the progress of whatever shadowed her through the undergrowth. The stalker was maintaining a distance of perhaps 20 or 30 feet, never closing but never falling behind, a constant presence that transformed the open moorland into a gauntlet of terror. Every survival instinct screamed at her to run, but some deeper wisdom held her to a brisk walk. Running might trigger the chase response in whatever hunted her. Running might mark her conclusively as prey. So she walked, her heart hammering, her breathing ragged with controlled panic, while the invisible predator kept pace through the heather. Several times she caught glimpses of something moving, a flash of black between the stalks, a suggestion of muscular form, but never a clear view. The not seeing was almost worse than seeing would have been, allowing her imagination to fill the gaps with every terror her mind could conjure. Then, after what felt like hours but was likely little more than 20 minutes, the presence vanished. The sounds in the heather ceased. The feeling of being watched evaporated as suddenly as it had arrived. She was alone on the path again, truly alone, and the relief was so intense that her legs nearly gave way beneath her. She did not slow down. She did not stop to rest. She walked with grim determination until she reached her car, locked herself inside, and only then allowed herself to fully acknowledge what had happened. Something had stalked her across the moor, something large and calculating enough to maintain that terrifying parallel course. Something that had chosen, for reasons she would never understand, to let her go. The consistency of these accounts is what lends them such credibility. Witness after witness, separated by years and miles, describe the same creature. Jet black fur, so dark it seems to absorb light. Muscular build, powerful and dense. Size comparable to a large dog, but unmistakably feline in every movement and feature. And always, always, those piercing yellow eyes that glow in reflected light, regarding humans with an unsettling intelligence. These are not vague descriptions of shadowy shapes glimpsed at great distance. These are detailed accounts from people close enough to see clearly, close enough to note specific features, close enough to feel genuinely threatened. The witnesses come from all walks of life, united only by their encounter with something that should not exist in the British countryside. The psychological toll on these witnesses varies but follows recognizable patterns. Many report changes in their relationship with the landscape itself. The moor, once a place of beauty and recreation, becomes tinged with menace. The knowledge that something powerful and predatory might be watching from the heather transforms every walk into an exercise in vigilance. Some stop visiting the moorland altogether, unable to shake the memory of yellow eyes or the sound of breathing in the undergrowth. Others become determined to validate their experience, returning to the sites of their encounters, sometimes obsessively, hoping for another glimpse, or perhaps for proof that might convince the skeptics. They photograph every black shape, investigate every report, connect with other witnesses in search of solidarity and confirmation. The weight of disbelief can be crushing. To know something with absolute certainty, to have witnessed it with your own eyes, and then to face doubt or dismissal from others, creates a profound sense of isolation. It divides the world into those who have seen and those who have not, with a gulf of understanding between them that words struggle to bridge. Yet the witnesses persist in telling their stories, compiling a body of testimony that collectively paints a remarkably consistent picture of these mysterious cats. The details align too perfectly, too specifically, to be dismissed as mass delusion or attention-seeking fabrication. These are credible people describing credible encounters with creatures that official reality insists cannot be there. The Beast of Exmoor, captured imperfectly in Trevor Beer's photographs, glimpsed in headlights by startled motorists, and stalking silently through the heather beside terrified hikers, remains stubbornly present in the landscape and in the testimonies of those who have crossed its path. The yellow eyes continue to watch from the shadows, indifferent to human doubt, patient and predatory, and impossibly, undeniably there. The moorland dawn broke cold and gray on the 5th of March, 1993, when a local dog walker named Tony Holder made a discovery along the banks of the River Fowey that would ignite one of the most contentious scientific debates in British cryptozoology. His terrier, nosing through the undergrowth near a cluster of ancient oaks, had unearthed something that stopped Holder in his tracks. There, partially embedded in the soft riverbank soil, lay a skull. Not just any skull, but something large, powerful, distinctly predatory. The bone was weathered but intact, the eye sockets dark and hollow, the jaw structure unmistakably feline. Holder, hands trembling slightly as he lifted the skull from the mud, knew immediately that this was no domestic animal. The weight of it, the size of the cranium, the pronounced sagittal crest running along the top where powerful jaw muscles would have attached, all spoke to something far more formidable than anything supposed to roam the British countryside. What followed was a cascade of expert examination that would later become emblematic of the frustrating cycle of revelation and retraction that defines the hunt for big cats in Britain. Holder did exactly what any responsible citizen would do. He contacted the authorities, and the skull made its way to the Natural History Museum in London, arguably the most prestigious zoological institution in the world. There, Senior curator of mammals examined the specimen with meticulous care, measuring the cranial capacity, analyzing the dental structure, studying the bone density and morphology. The initial verdict came back unequivocal. This was a leopard skull, consistent with Panthera pardus, aged approximately 5 to 10 years, female based on size parameters. The confirmation seemed to provide the physical proof that researchers had sought for decades. Here was tangible evidence, held in hand, measured and verified by trained experts, that a large exotic cat had indeed lived and died on British soil. But then came the reversal that would haunt investigators for years to come. Under renewed scrutiny and additional testing, a different conclusion emerged from the same institution. The museum now stated that while the skull was indeed from a leopard, further analysis suggested it had been imported, possibly from a tropical region, and had been in Britain for a relatively short time before being discarded or lost. The crucial detail that shifted the narrative was the condition of the bone itself. Experts pointed to certain degradation patterns they claimed were inconsistent with a prolonged exposure to British weather conditions. They suggested the skull might have come from a leopard skin rug or a taxidermy specimen, deliberately or accidentally disposed of in the river. The explanation felt anticlimactic, even suspicious to many who had followed the case. How could the same experts who had initially confirmed its significance now dismiss it so readily? Some researchers noted that the museum seemed particularly cautious about making definitive statements that might lend credence to the big cat phenomenon, perhaps wary of professional ridicule or the complexity such confirmation would create. This pattern of tantalizing evidence followed by official skepticism extends far beyond a single skull. Over the decades, a substantial body of physical evidence has accumulated across Cornwall, Devon, Scotland, Wales, and virtually every rural region of Britain. Plaster casts of paw prints tell perhaps the most compelling story. These aren't vague impressions in mud that could be anything or nothing. They are detailed casts showing pad structure, claw marks, and dimensions that simply do not match any native British species. Some of these prints measure over 4 inches across, displaying the characteristic four-toed pattern with a tri-lobed heel pad typical of large felid. Experienced trackers who have worked with big cats in Africa and Asia have examined these casts and identified them as consistent with leopard, puma, or lynx. The spacing between prints indicates a stride length impossible for dogs or foxes. The depth of the impression in firm ground suggests an animal weighing upwards of 100 pounds. In 1988, a set of tracks discovered near Bodmin Moor were examined by a wildlife expert who had spent 15 years studying predators in Kenya. His assessment was unambiguous. The prints belonged to a large cat, most likely a black leopard based on size and gait pattern. He noted the retracted claw marks, a defining characteristic of felids that separates them from canids who cannot retract their claws. Yet despite his credentials and experience, the official response remained non-committal. The tracks were filed away as interesting but inconclusive. Fur samples present another layer of physical evidence that defies easy dismissal. Strands of black hair, coarse and distinctly different from any domestic animal, have been collected from barbed wire fences, caught on brambles near kill sites, and found clinging to the bark of trees. When these samples have been analyzed by zoologists and forensic hair specialists, results have frequently identified characteristics consistent with large exotic cats. The medulla pattern, the scale structure of the cuticle, the overall diameter of the hair shaft, all point towards something that shouldn't exist in the British ecosystem. A sample collected in Scotland in 2021 was analyzed at a university laboratory and returned results indicating the hair belonged to a member of the Felidae family, specifically ruling out domestic cats, dogs, horses, cattle, deer, and all common British mammals. The researcher who conducted the analysis admitted profound puzzlement. The evidence in front of her suggested the presence of an animal that officially wasn't there. The claw marks present perhaps the most visually dramatic evidence. Deep gouges scored into tree bark at heights of 8, 9, even 10 feet above ground level. These aren't the scratches left by badgers or the territorial markings of deer. They are parallel grooves, evenly spaced, driven deep into hardwood by claws of considerable strength. Big cats mark territory by raking trees, standing on hind legs to reach as high as possible, advertising their presence to rivals and potential mates. When researchers find these marks on ancient oaks and ash trees in remote woodlands, at heights no native British animal could possibly reach, the implications are difficult to ignore. A large cat marking territory behaves exactly as wild felids do across the world. The evidence matches the behavior perfectly. DNA evidence has emerged as both the most promising and most frustrating avenue of scientific investigation. Kill sites where sheep, deer, and rabbits have been found with characteristic feline kill methods. Throat punctures from large canines, bodies partially consumed with feeding patterns unlike foxes or dogs. These sites have yielded biological material for testing. Saliva from bite wounds, blood that isn't from the prey animal, occasional hair or scat, all have been collected and sent to laboratories for genetic analysis. Results have returned showing feline markers, genetic sequences consistent with large cats. In 2012, DNA extracted from a deer carcass in Devon showed sequences that partially matched those of a leopard. Not conclusively, not with absolute certainty, but enough to raise profound questions. Here lies the central frustration that has plagued this entire field of investigation. Scientific proof demands repeatability, certainty, comprehensive data. What researchers have instead is a mosaic of partial evidence, suggestive but never quite definitive. DNA degrades rapidly in British weather conditions. Samples are often contaminated by environmental exposure or handling. Laboratories return results with caveats and qualifications. The genetic signature suggests felid but cannot exclude all other possibilities. The hair is consistent with exotic cat, but the sample is too degraded for species-level identification. The paw print matches big cat morphology, but without a living specimen for direct comparison, absolute confirmation remains elusive. The skeptical counterarguments deserve serious consideration because they are substantial and, in many cases, entirely valid. Misidentification stands as the most obvious explanation for a significant percentage of sightings and evidence. Large domestic cats, particularly Maine Coons or Norwegian forest cats, can appear surprisingly substantial, especially when glimpsed briefly in poor light. Dogs, particularly dark-colored breeds seen in profile, can be mistaken for large cats by observers unfamiliar with animal morphology. Deer moving through undergrowth create sounds and patterns of movement that startled witnesses can interpret as predatory stalking. Hoaxes absolutely occur. Some individuals, seeking attention or amusement, deliberately create false evidence. Fake paw prints can be made with carved molds. Hair samples can be obtained from zoos or taxidermy suppliers and strategically planted. Photographs can be digitally manipulated or employ perspective tricks to make ordinary animals appear extraordinary. The 1995 photograph purporting to show a large black cat in Cornwall was later revealed to have been created using a small stuffed toy positioned close to the camera. These hoaxes undermine legitimate research and poison the well for serious investigation. The psychology of mass hysteria provides another lens through which skeptics view the phenomenon. When media attention focuses on big cat reports in a particular area, sighting frequency increases dramatically. People become primed to interpret ambiguous stimuli as confirming their expectations. A large dog becomes a panther. A roe deer becomes a puma. The power of suggestion is profound and well documented in psychological literature. Communities can develop collective narratives that reinforce themselves through repetition and social confirmation. Yet for all these valid skeptical points, the physical evidence persists in ways that resist complete dismissal. The sheer volume of material collected over decades, the consistency of certain types of evidence across widely separated geographic regions, the professional credentials of some witnesses and analysts all create a picture more complex than simple misidentification or hysteria. Something is leaving 4-inch paw prints in remote moorland. Something is taking down sheep with killing methods that experienced farmers insist are not the work of dogs. Something left that skull on the banks of the River Fowey, regardless of how it arrived in Britain. The frustration for researchers lies in existing in this liminal space between proof and dismissal, accumulating evidence that seems compelling but never quite crosses the threshold into scientific acceptance. Each new piece of physical evidence raises hope that this will be the conclusive proof, only to encounter the same cycle of qualified analysis and eventual inconclusiveness. The beast remains tantalizingly out of reach, leaving traces of its presence but never quite revealing itself fully to the scrutiny of science. The 21st century brought something new to the hunt for the Beast of Exmoor and its dark cousins across the Southwest. While the legends remained rooted in shadow and mystery, the tools of the searchers transformed completely. Gone were the days when a sighting meant little more than a breathless account and perhaps a blurred photograph clutched in trembling hands. Now, the moorlands bristle with technology. Trail cameras mount on ancient oaks, their infrared sensors sweeping the darkness. Motion detectors stand silent vigil in valleys where sheep graze nervously. Thermal imaging devices scan the bracken and gorse, searching for the heat signature of something that should not exist. Yet despite this arsenal of modern surveillance, despite the dedication of researchers who have devoted years to solving this mystery, the beast remains as elusive as smoke, as maddening as a half-remembered dream. The modern obsession truly began around 2010, when affordable trail cameras became widely available to civilian researchers. What had once been the exclusive domain of wildlife biologists suddenly opened to anyone willing to trek into the remote corners of Exmoor or the dense forests surrounding Bodmin. Groups formed with names like the Big Cat's UK Research Team and the Center for Fortean Zoology's Big Cat Division. These were not sensation seekers or amateur ghost hunters. Many were former military personnel, experienced outdoorsmen, people with backgrounds in tracking and wildlife observation. They approached the mystery with methodical precision, mapping sighting clusters, analyzing attack patterns on livestock, and most importantly, installing networks of cameras across the moorland. Trevor House, a retired gamekeeper from near Dulverton, became one of the most dedicated researchers. He spent his retirement mounting cameras on his own property and throughout the surrounding valleys of Exmoor. Night after night, he reviewed footage. Deer passing through clearings, badgers snuffling along woodland paths, foxes on their nightly rounds. Then, in March of 2012, one of his cameras captured something else. The footage, later analyzed frame by wildlife experts, showed a large feline shape moving through tall grass at dusk. The animal's gait was unmistakably cat-like, fluid and purposeful. Its shoulder height suggested something far larger than any domestic breed. The footage lasted only 7 seconds before the creature moved beyond the camera's field of view, but those 7 seconds ignited fierce debate. Skeptics claimed it could be a large domestic cat closer to the camera than it appeared. Believers pointed to the comparison with fence posts in the background, suggesting an animal standing at least 2 feet at the shoulder. The footage made regional news, then national broadcasts, then internet forums around the world. The hunt intensified. By 2015, an estimated 300 trail cameras were operating across the Southwest, maintained by dozens of independent researchers and organized groups. They captured thousands of hours of footage. Most showed nothing unusual. Some showed ambiguous shapes that could be anything or nothing. But occasionally, something compelling emerged. A camera in Cornwall recorded what appeared to be a melanistic leopard drinking from a stream, though the angle made definitive identification impossible. Another near Minehead captured glowing eyes at a height inconsistent with any known British wildlife, watching the camera from dense undergrowth before disappearing. Each piece of footage was dissected, enhanced, debated. Experts weighed in. Zoologists from universities examined the images. Former big cat handlers from zoos offered opinions. The consensus remained frustratingly divided. Then came Dulverton, in the summer of 2016, and everything changed again. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late July, around 3 o'clock, broad daylight with clear skies. The first call came from Sarah Mitchell, a teacher driving home along the B3223 just outside town. She reported seeing a large black cat, easily the size of a Labrador but sleeker and more powerful, cross the road approximately 50 meters ahead of her vehicle. The animal moved with liquid grace from the hedgerow on one side to the stone wall on the other, clearing the wall in a single bound that she described as effortless and beautiful, and absolutely terrifying, all at once. She pulled over, shaking, and called the police. Within 20 minutes, 2 more calls arrived. David and Emma Cartwright, walking their dog near the river, had seen what they described as a black panther moving along the opposite bank, its attention fixed 50 years have passed since the first credible sightings emerged from the moorlands of Exmoor, and yet we find ourselves no closer to the truth. Hundreds of witnesses, dozens of investigations, countless hours of surveillance, and still the beast remains exactly what it has always been: a shadow, a rumor, a presence felt but never proven. The question that haunts researchers and skeptics alike is perhaps the simplest one of all. How has something so large, so frequently seen, managed to evade definitive capture or identification for half a century? The mathematics of survival suggest something remarkable. If even a single breeding pair of big cats was released onto these moors in the mid-1970s, when the Dangerous Wild Animals Act made exotic pet ownership suddenly complicated and expensive, the implications become staggering. A healthy puma, or melanistic leopard, can live 15 to 20 years in the wild. They reach sexual maturity between 2 and 3 years of age. A single female can produce litters of 2 to 4 cubs. The numbers compound quickly. What began as one animal, perhaps released by a private collector unwilling to comply with new regulations, could theoretically have become dozens by now. Generations born wild, never knowing human contact, learning the landscape as their ancestors learned the mountains of South America, or the forests of Southeast Asia. These theoretical descendants would possess something their released parent never had. They would be truly wild. Born on the moors, raised to hunt red deer and sheep, navigating the vast expanses of heather and woodland without any memory of captivity. They would know which farms to avoid, which valleys remain untraveled by humans, where the cameras are placed, and how to move around them. Evolution in action, not over millennia but over decades. Natural selection favoring the most cautious, the most elusive, the most invisible. The landscape itself conspires to keep secrets. Exmoor National Park covers more than 267 square miles of some of the most remote terrain in southern England. Add the surrounding moorlands, the forests, the deep combes and hidden valleys, and you have a wilderness far larger and more impenetrable than most people imagine. There are places on these moors where human feet rarely tread, where the only sounds are wind and rain and the calls of birds. A large predator that has learned to avoid human contact could live an entire lifetime in these spaces, crossing roads only at night, hunting in the vast, uninhabited stretches between scattered farmsteads. But the landscape alone cannot explain everything. The question of evidence, or rather the curious absence of certain evidence, opens darker possibilities. Researchers who worked on early investigations have noted something troubling: official records that seem incomplete, files that were opened and then abruptly closed, physical evidence that was collected and then somehow disappeared from the chain of custody. One former Ministry of Agriculture official, speaking years after retirement, mentioned photographs taken by government wildlife experts in the early 1980s that showed tracks he could not identify as any native species. Those photographs, he claimed, were removed from the file before it was archived. Then there is the matter of the Royal Marines' deployment in 1983. For 2 weeks, trained military personnel with night vision equipment and high-powered rifles conducted what was effectively a hunting operation across the moors. The official statement afterward was dismissive. No evidence of big cats found, mystery solved, case closed. But witnesses who lived through that period tell a different story. They speak of Marines who returned from night patrols looking shaken, refusing to discuss what they had seen, of local farmers who were visited by officials and asked with varying degrees of pressure to reconsider their earlier statements about livestock kills that showed unusual predation patterns. One shepherd, now deceased, told his daughter before his death that he had been shown photographs during that time, images of something killed on the moors that he was told must never be discussed. When she asked what was in the photographs, he would only say that some questions are better left unasked. His farm bordered military land, and he had seen the Marines dragging something large and covered with tarps into a truck one night. He never spoke of it publicly. Fear, or pragmatism, or perhaps an understanding that certain truths are not meant for official acknowledgement. The government's response to the beast sightings has always been peculiar. Initial dismissal, then sudden intense activity, then abrupt withdrawal and silence. This pattern repeats across decades. Investigations are launched with apparent seriousness. Resources are committed, experts are brought in, and then everything stops. Official statements are released that contradict the testimony of the investigators themselves. Files are sealed or redacted. The message is clear. Move along, nothing to see here, the matter is closed. But why such concern over what should be at worst a minor wildlife management issue? If big cats were confirmed on Exmoor, the practical response would be straightforward. Controlled hunting, capture programs, public awareness campaigns. Instead, there has been what can only be described as institutional evasion. Some researchers suggest the explanation is embarrassment. Admitting that large predators have established themselves in the British countryside would raise uncomfortable questions about ecological monitoring and wildlife management capabilities. Others propose more troubling theories, that the government knows exactly what is out there and has decided that public knowledge would create problems worse than the mystery itself. Consider what confirmation would mean. Suddenly, parents would fear letting children play in moorland areas. Tourism might suffer. Property values in remote areas could decline. Farmers would demand compensation and government action. The cost of managing a confirmed big cat population, both financially and politically, would be substantial. Perhaps the decision was made at some level that ambiguity serves everyone better than certainty. Let it remain a legend, a story, something that probably is not real. Much simpler than admitting we share these islands with apex predators we cannot control. The witnesses themselves add another layer to the mystery. Over the years, several people who reported sightings or found evidence later recanted their stories. Some offered explanations about mistaken identity or tricks of light, but others simply went silent, refusing to discuss the matter further. A farmer who found his prize ram killed in a manner inconsistent with dog attacks initially spoke to newspapers and showed the carcass to wildlife experts. Within a week, he was telling reporters he had been mistaken. It was definitely dogs. The matter was closed. When a local journalist pressed him, he said only that he had received advice that continuing to discuss the incident would not be in his best interests. He would not elaborate on who had given that advice. These stories accumulate, building a picture not just of an elusive animal, but of something stranger. A conspiracy of silence, whether coordinated or emergent, official or social. The truth becomes not just difficult to find, but actively obscured, buried under layers of recantation and redaction and deliberate forgetting. And yet the sightings continue. Every year brings new reports, new witnesses, new encounters that defy easy explanation. A hiker sees something too large to be a dog moving through the bracken. A driver glimpses yellow eyes, reflecting in headlights before something massive bounds across the road. A farmer finds tracks that measure 4 inches across, with no claw marks, the distinctive pattern of a feline predator. The moorlands keep offering hints, fragments, suggestions of a presence that refuses to be dismissed entirely. The moors themselves remain what they've always been: wild, vast, indifferent to human certainty. On a clear day, you can stand on Dunkery Beacon and see for miles in every direction, rolling hills of heather and gorse, deep valleys filled with ancient oak woods, and the sea beyond. It looks tamed, this landscape, crossed with footpaths and dotted with farms. But walk into those valleys at dusk, when the light fails and the wind picks up, and you remember how quickly the illusion of control dissolves. The paths disappear in the gathering dark. The distant farmhouse lights become unreachable. You are in a wilderness that tolerates your presence but does not belong to you. In such a place, on moonless nights, when the fog rolls in from the Bristol Channel and visibility drops to mere feet, it is easy to believe in things that official reports deny. Easy to imagine yellow eyes watching from the heather, a shape moving with perfect silence through the darkness, a predator that has learned over generations to avoid the upright apes who build their fires and carry their lights, but who ultimately remain visitors in a kingdom they never truly conquered. The Beast of Exmoor, whether myth or reality or something stranger still, endures not despite our investigations, but perhaps because of them, thriving in the gaps between what we can prove and what we know to be true. Somewhere out there, in the wild places we have forgotten are not entirely ours. Something watches and waits, an emperor without subjects, a mystery without solution. A reminder that some questions remain unanswered, not because we lack the means to answer them, but because the answers were never meant to be ours to find. that's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.